At 23 years old, Paige Nash stood alone in Lady Pemberton's ballroom, where whispers had already decided she was unmarriageable, too plain, too difficult, a woman who had wasted 3 seasons refusing to learn what silence cost. She had made her peace with invisibility, had learned to move through these glittering rooms like furniture, present but unnoticed, attending but unacknowledged. Other young ladies her age were married now, settled, useful. She was simply still here, a cautionary tale about the price of honesty. Then, Louis Perry, Duke of Westwick, the most pursued man in London, surrounded always by women who had perfected every calculated smile, stopped mid-conversation with Lady Dorothea Hartwell, looked directly at Paige standing near the terrace doors, and began walking toward her. The conversations around them faltered, heads turned, opera glasses lifted. Paige's first thought was that he must be looking at someone behind her. Her second thought was worse, that if he wasn't, every woman in the room would remember this moment as her final embarrassment. But he kept coming, and when he reached her, when those exhausted blue eyes met hers, he said the last thing she expected. "Miss Nash, I wondered if we might speak honestly for a moment." Honestly, as if he knew that was the one thing she'd never been allowed to be. Will the Duke's sudden interest be her salvation or her final public humiliation? Stay tuned.
Paige Nash stood where the Duke of Westwick had just left her, still near the terrace doors of the Ashworth Ballroom, still unnoticed by everyone except him. Her gray silk dress was well made but deliberately unfashionable, a flag of surrender she'd raised 2 seasons ago. Across the room, her younger sister Marianne laughed at something her dance partner said, her third dance of the evening. She was contemplating an early exit when she noticed him again, Louis Perry, Duke of Westwick, surrounded by his usual constellation of admirers. Lady Dorothea Hartwell clung to his arm with practiced possession, her laugh carrying across the ballroom like a claim. Louis Perry made the appropriate responses with the automaticity of a man who'd been performing the same role for 7 years. Smile, nod, compliment Lady Dorothea's observation about the weather. She was recounting an anecdote he'd heard twice before, each time with slightly different details, as if testing which version pleased him most. Around him, 5 other young ladies and their mamas orbited, present not because they enjoyed his company, but because they wanted his title. His friend Ashworth caught his eye from across the room, grinning, clearly amused by Louis's predicament. Louis excused himself with practiced diplomacy, extracting his arm from Dorothea's grasp on the pretext of needing air. He moved toward the terrace. That's when he saw her again, the woman in gray, slipping through the terrace doors ahead of him. Paige had just taken her first full breath of night air when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, and found herself facing the Duke of Westwick. She prepared to curtsy and flee, the expected behavior when a woman of no consequence encountered a duke, but the exhaustion in his expression mirrored her own too perfectly. For once, she was too tired to perform even the theater of deference. "You looked as though you were cataloging species," he said. "I was," she replied honestly before she could stop herself. "The mating rituals of the English aristocracy, quite predictable once you understand the patterns." He should have been offended. Instead, something shifted in his expression, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. "That's rather cynical." "Is it, or simply observant? There's often little difference between the two." He moved to the balustrade, studying her. "Though I'm curious what patterns you think you've identified." It was a test. She recognized it immediately, the slight edge in his voice, the way he waited for her response. He expected her to retreat, to soften her statement with apology or feminine charm. "The eager mamas positioning daughters," she said instead. "The gentlemen assessing prospects like horses at market. The rehearsed laughter timed perfectly to masculine wit. It repeats every season with minor variations, botanically efficient if intellectually unstimulating." "You make it sound like a scientific study." "Would you prefer I pretend it's romantic?" "I'd prefer you tell me what you actually think." His tone had shifted, less challenge, more genuine interest. "Most people don't." Most people want something from you, Your Grace. I imagine honesty feels risky when strategy is safer. He went very still. And what category do you fall into? The one that wants nothing from you, which is why I can afford to be honest. For a long moment he simply looked at her. Then, and the female specimens in your taxonomy? Divided into two categories, those who've learned the performance and those who've been discarded for failing to learn it. Which are you? The latter, obviously. There was no self-pity in her voice, just observation. He leaned against the terrace balustrade, and something in his posture relaxed. What are you reading at the moment? The shift surprised her. Burke, though I find him, what? Overly concerned with maintaining order at the expense of justice. You prefer pain, then? I prefer thinking for myself. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. Miss Nash, Paige Nash. Miss Nash, have you always been this direct? She thought of Lord Pemberton 3 years ago, the way his interest had curdled when she'd spoken honestly, the lesson she'd learned too late. Once, she said quietly, I learned it was inadvisable. And yet you're being direct now. I suppose I've decided inadvisable is better than invisible. They talked about London. She found it suffocating, he found it performative. About marriage, she noted that affection seemed optional. He said he'd started to believe it might be impossible. The conversation moved like a real exchange, not the careful dance she'd watched all evening. Neither realized how much time had passed until the terrace doors burst open. Mrs. Nash stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale. Her eyes darted between her daughter and the Duke, calculating scandal, social ruin, the younger daughter's prospects crumbling because Paige had been alone with a Duke for how long? 20 minutes? Half an hour? Paige, her voice shook. Your sister is looking for you. It was a lie, and they all knew it. Paige's stomach dropped. She'd done it again, spoken too freely, forgotten herself, broken every rule. The Duke would walk away now, embarrassed to have been caught in compromising circumstances with someone so unsuitable. I should return, she said, not meeting his eyes. May I call on you? The words stopped her. She looked at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. Why would you do that? Because this is the first genuine conversation I've had in months. That's very sad for you, Your Grace. Mrs. Nash made a small, horrified sound. Paige curtsied finally and let her mother pull her inside. Louis remained on the terrace, unsure what had just happened, but certain of one thing. He wanted more of whatever that was. That night, Paige sat in her bedroom while her mother paced, torn between terror and hope. Alone with a Duke for nearly half an hour? If anyone saw, but if he calls, if he actually calls, Paige, what were you thinking? I wasn't thinking, Mama. I never do. That's always been the problem. She'd imagined the interest in his eyes. She must have. By morning, she'd convince herself it had been a moment of mutual exhaustion, nothing more. In his study, Louis sat with a glass of brandy, remembering every word she'd said, the way she'd called the mating market predictable, the absence of performance in her voice, the fact that she'd asked him why he'd want to call her, as if his interest required justification. He felt as though he'd been asleep for 7 years and had just woken up. Before we go on, don't be like everyone else who watched Paige be invisible and walked away. If you believe moments like this matter, prove it. Subscribe now. Don't disappear on her.
Paige had convinced herself the terrace conversation meant nothing. 2 days had passed without word, and she'd returned to her usual routine. Mornings in the library, afternoons enduring obligatory social calls. She was reading Hume in a simple brown day dress when the butler appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. His Grace, the Duke of Westwick. Time stopped. Her mother's teacup clattered against its saucer. Marianne's eyes went wide. Paige's first thought was that he must have come to see Marianne, her beautiful, charming, appropriate younger sister. But when Louis entered the drawing room, his eyes went directly to Paige. Miss Nash, I wondered if you might continue our conversation from the other evening. Mrs. Nash positioned herself on a chair across the room, her spine rigid with anxiety. Marianne disappeared with remarkable speed. I spent 3 hours in Parliament today listening to men lie to one another, Louie said, settling into a chair opposite Paige. "I found myself wondering what you would have said from the gallery. Tell me, Miss Nash, do you believe duty is worth the price of desire?" Paige's fingers tightened on her book. The question wasn't academic. It hung between them like a challenge. "I think desire without duty is chaos," she said carefully. "But duty without desire is slow death." "Then how does one choose between them?" "Perhaps the question isn't which to choose, but whether they must always be opposed." Mrs. Nash suddenly thrust forward with a plate of expensive cakes. "Your Grace, please, do try the lemon. Paige has always been so opinionated, you mustn't take her seriously." "I take her very seriously, Mrs. Nash," Louie said, without looking away from Paige. He'd never met anyone who so casually ignored the unspoken rules of society. "Please, Miss Nash, continue." Paige felt heat rise to her cheeks. She tucked her right hand with its telltale ink stain beneath the book in her lap. Had he noticed? Would he think less of her? "I only meant that perhaps duty becomes bearable when it aligns with what we actually value, when it's chosen rather than imposed." "That's idealistic." "Is it? Or is it simply honest about what makes a life worth living?" Did he think she was clever or reckless? He leaned forward. "But you're assuming people have the freedom to choose their duties. Most of us inherit them." "Then perhaps the question is whether we have the courage to examine what we've inherited, to ask if it still serves us or if we're simply serving it out of habit." Most women would have softened that statement with a smile, a demurral. She delivered it like a verdict. Mrs. Nash made a small, distressed sound. "Paige, dear, I'm sure His Grace doesn't want to hear—" "I do want to hear," Louie interrupted gently. "Very much." They debated. Actually debated. He challenged her on the nature of obligation. She pushed back on his assumptions about individual agency. When she made a strong point about the tyranny of unexamined tradition, he conceded it. When he raised the specter of social collapse without shared duty, she considered it seriously before explaining why she still disagreed. She wasn't performing agreement. She was thinking, right there in front of him, unafraid of being wrong. Mrs. Nash watched with mounting horror, periodically attempting to interject with offers of tea, comments about the weather, desperate attempts to redirect the conversation to appropriate topics. But Louie was riveted. Every word Paige spoke was genuine. She wasn't studying his reactions. She wasn't calculating her next move. She was just being herself, and it was like water after years of drought. He noticed the moment she tried to hide her ink-stained finger, the small gesture of self-consciousness, the first crack in her armor. She cared what he thought. Despite everything she said about not trying to please him, she cared. "Why aren't you like the others?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Because the others are trying to please you," Paige said. "I've never had reason to think that was achievable, so I stopped trying." "That's the saddest thing I've heard all week." "Is it? I find it liberating." A book shifted in her lap, the rustle of pages breaking the silence. He stayed for an hour. When he finally rose to leave, his gaze fell on the book she'd been reading. "Hume," he observed, "on human understanding. I find his ideas about perception compelling." "Do you?" He smiled slightly. "Hume would say our impressions are the foundation of all knowledge. My impression of you, Miss Nash, is that you are anything but invisible." She had no response to that. He asked if he might call again. "If you wish," Paige said, as if she still didn't believe this was real. The moment the door closed, Mrs. Nash erupted. "You argued with him about duty and desire, as if you were discussing marriage itself. Paige, you must learn to be more agreeable or you'll ruin this opportunity." "Mama, there is no opportunity. He's simply bored, and I'm novel. It will pass." But that night, she lay awake replaying every moment, remembering the way he'd looked at her when she tried to hide the ink stain, as if he'd seen something that pleased him. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't passing curiosity, but something more dangerous, something that could break her if she let herself hope? What if he made her want a life she could never have?
The thought terrified her more than any dismissal ever had. This is the point where most viewers look away. Paige doesn't have many witnesses. If you're still here, subscribe. Don't let her face what's coming alone. The light dims. The hopeful melody fades into something lower, colder. Across London, in Lady Hartwell's drawing room draped in silk and shadow, Dorothea received the news with a teacup frozen halfway to her lips. "An hour?" she said softly. "He spent an hour with the Nash girl?" Her mother nodded, expression tight. "Debating politics, apparently, like she's his intellectual equal." Dorothea set down her cup with careful precision. The porcelain met the saucer without a sound. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "How fascinating. And I think it's time I paid Miss Nash a visit to welcome her into society properly." The promise of cruelty hung in the air, like perfume.
The encounters began to form a pattern, though neither would admit they were orchestrating them. Louie found Paige during her morning walk in Hyde Park, her maid trailing at a respectful distance. The meeting appeared accidental, though he'd learned her routine through careful observation. "Miss Nash, what a pleasant surprise." "Is it?" She didn't sound convinced, but she didn't sound displeased either. They walked together, discussing architecture. Paige mentioned she found most London townhouses ostentatious, all facade, no soul. "I've always thought the same," Louie admitted, "but I've never heard anyone else say so." Perhaps no one else has the luxury of honesty. Other walkers noticed, heads turned, whispers followed in their wake. A duke walking with Paige Nash? The gossip began like ripples on water. 3 days later, Louie found her at Hatchard's bookshop, debating with the clerk about the latest quarterly review. "I was told it arrived yesterday," Paige said, her voice patient but firm. "I assure you, miss, we haven't received the October issue. With the essay on prison reform, I saw the shipping manifest myself last week." Louie watched from behind a shelf, fascinated. She was completely unself-conscious when engaged with ideas, all pretense forgotten. When she finally noticed him, she didn't simper or blush. "Your Grace, have you read the essay on prison reform?" "I haven't." "You should. The author argues that punishment without rehabilitation is merely cruelty disguised as justice." They debated in the middle of the bookshop, their voices rising and falling with intellectual passion. Near the poetry section, a group of debutantes shielded their faces with their fans, their eyes darting from the Duke's expensive coat to Paige's sensible shoes. One whispered something behind her gloved hand. The others tittered. Paige didn't notice. Louie did, and didn't care. She wasn't performing, she was just thinking aloud, trusting him to follow. The dinner party at Lady Pemberton's was different. Paige was seated far from Louie, included only because her mother was friends with the hostess. She looked uncomfortable in her evening dress, aware of being on display. During dinner, someone raised the question of women's education. The table went quiet. It was a controversial topic. Paige, forgetting herself, spoke. "Women's minds are wasted by frivolous education. We're capable of the same intellectual rigor as men, but we're taught to pretend otherwise." Shocked silence. Lady Cambourne, a friend of Dorothea's mother, set down her fork with deliberate precision. "How very radical of you, Miss Nash. Perhaps if women spent more time cultivating grace and less time cultivating opinions, they might find themselves better situated in society." Several guests nodded. A gentleman across the table smirked. Paige felt her cheeks burn. She'd done it again, spoken without thinking, broken the rules everyone else followed effortlessly. Then, from the other end of the table, Louie's voice cut through the tension. "I agree with Miss Nash. You just watched someone risk his reputation for her voice. The least you can do is not vanish after seeing that. Subscribe. Staying matters." Every head turned. "A mind is a terrible thing to waste regardless of gender," he continued calmly. "If we educate our daughters to think,
Perhaps they'll raise sons capable of doing the same. The power dynamic shifted instantly. If the Duke agreed, perhaps the opinion wasn't outrageous after all. The conversation continued, but Paige was shaken, aware she'd nearly committed social suicide and that Louis had intervened. After dinner, he found her on the terrace. Their places of honest conversation were always liminal spaces, thresholds, gardens, terraces. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Protect me." "I wasn't protecting you, I was agreeing with you. There's a difference." "Is there? Or were you simply being kind to someone who doesn't know when to be silent?" "Paige." It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. She froze, her eyes darted toward the terrace doors. Had anyone heard? Her maid was inside, but if a guest had stepped out, the intimacy of it terrified her more than any insult. "What if I'm tired of silence?" he continued, his voice low. "What if I want to hear what you actually think?" She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something that terrified her. Sincerity. This wasn't just interesting conversation anymore. Something real was developing. Paige was afraid because she knew what happened to women like her who hoped for too much. Louis was afraid because he was starting to believe this might be the truth he'd been searching for, and if he was wrong, it would break something essential in him. That night in his study, Louis sat across from Ashworth with a glass of brandy. "I think I'm going to court her. Properly." Ashworth stared. "You'll be a laughingstock." "She's nobody. She's plain. She's odd. She's honest." Louis's voice was quiet but certain. "And I've been drowning in beautiful lies for 7 years. You're serious?" "Entirely." Ashworth studied his friend's face and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Hope. "God help you both, then."
Louis had been thinking about Paige constantly, replaying their conversations like a man searching for something he'd lost. And then, 3 nights after the dinner party, the memory surfaced. Lady Hartwell's ball. 3 years ago, a young woman with dark eyes and an unfashionable dress who'd asked him about the Corn Laws. She disagreed with him respectfully but firmly, arguing that they were morally indefensible because they valued landowner profits over human starvation. He'd been charmed. Distracted by obligations, he'd meant to seek her out again. When he finally looked, she'd vanished. That was Paige, before she became invisible. He'd been half in love with the memory of that conversation for 3 years. Now he'd found her again. The realization crystallized his resolve. The next morning, he called on Mr. Nash. The country gentleman received him in his study, stunned but cautiously pleased. "Your Grace, are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything." Permission was granted. When her father told her, Paige's first reaction wasn't joy, it was panic. This was real. This meant exposure. Everyone would be watching, judging, waiting for her to fail. She requested a private meeting with Louis in her father's library. When he arrived, she stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself defensively. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, without preamble. "Because I want to know you better." "You could do that without making it public, without," she gestured helplessly, "without making a spectacle. Is that what concerns you, that people will talk?" "People always talk, Your Grace. Usually I'm beneath their notice. I prefer it that way." "Louis," he corrected gently, "and I don't believe you prefer it. You don't know what you're asking. You don't understand what it's like to be—" She stopped, struggling. "To be unremarkable, to have everyone look through you. You think you want honesty, but you've never experienced the cost of it." He crossed to her, close enough that she had to look up at him. 3 years ago, at the Hartwell ball, you told me the Corn Laws were morally indefensible. Do you remember?" She stared at him. That was years ago. I barely spoke to you for 5 minutes." "I've thought about that conversation at least once a month since then. You were the only person in that entire ballroom who treated me like a man capable of being wrong. I looked for you afterward. You disappeared." "I learned to disappear. It was safer." "I know, and I'm asking you to stop hiding, not for me, for yourself."
What if I'm not what you think I am? Her voice broke slightly. What if you're imagining something that isn't there? Paige. He took her hand, a liberty, but she didn't pull away. You think I haven't considered that I might be wrong? I've spent 7 years being courted by women who study me like a text they need to pass an examination on. They know my favorite color, my preferred brandy, the topics that please me. They've memorized me. Not one of them has ever contradicted me. Not one has ever trusted me enough to be angry with me, or bored with me, or honest with me. That doesn't make me special. That makes them tactical. Exactly. And you are the opposite of tactical. You don't want anything from me. How do you know that? Because if you did, you would have pretended to agree with me at that first ball 3 years ago. You would have laughed at my jokes at the bookshop. You would have been silent at Lady Pemberton's dinner. You would be smiling right now instead of trying to convince me to walk away. She was silent, caught. I'm not asking you to perform for me, he continued. I'm asking for permission to know you as you actually are. If that's ordinary, so be it, but I don't think it will be. Their first public outing as a courting couple was to the theater. The entire ton noticed. Paige sat beside Louis in his box, acutely aware of opera glasses turning in their direction. She wore her finest dress, which still wasn't fashionable, and tried to breathe normally. During the interval, visitors came. Lady Dorothea arrived first, beautiful and composed, her eyes glittering with barely concealed rage. Your Grace, Miss Nash, what an unexpected pairing. Unexpected, Louis said mildly. I find Miss Nash's company enlightening. Dorothea's smile sharpened like a blade. How generous of you, Louis, to take up charity work this season. One must admire your dedication to the duller things in life. The insult landed like a slap. Paige felt herself folding inward, preparing for invisibility. But then, Louis did something that changed everything. He took her hand, in full view of everyone, and said clearly, Lady Dorothea, I assure you, the generosity is entirely Miss Nash's in tolerating my company. He chose her in public. After everything she fears, after everything she risks, don't be the one who leaves now. Subscribe. She's finally being seen. It was a public claiming, a declaration. The visitors in the box fell silent. Dorothea's smile froze, her composure cracking for just a moment before she recovered. She inclined her head with icy grace and swept away. After she left, Paige whispered, You didn't need to do that. Yes, I did. I need you to understand that I'm not embarrassed by you. I'm not hiding you. I'm not going to let anyone treat you as lesser. Even though I am lesser, by every measure that matters to your world. You're not lesser. You're just harder to see. But I see you, Paige. It was too much. She excused herself, retreating to the ladies' retiring room where she could compose herself. When she looked in the mirror, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of terrified hope. That night, in her bedroom, Paige wrote in her journal by candlelight, He says he sees me, but what if who I am isn't enough? What if the truth of me is a disappointment? I've spent 3 years being invisible. At least that was safe. If you leave without subscribing, this is where Paige loses witnesses again. Her story continues, but only if you stay. Subscribe. Across London, Louis sat at his desk with his own journal. She thinks I'm making a mistake. She keeps trying to convince me she's ordinary. She doesn't understand that ordinary would be a relief. I'm so tired of extraordinary performances. In her own townhouse, Dorothea sat at her writing desk, a letter laid out before her. She dipped her pen in ink, composing each word with surgical precision. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and pressed her seal into hot wax, the Hartwell family crest gleaming in the candlelight. She smiled. If he wants a spectacle, she murmured to the empty room, I shall give him one he will never forget.
The gossip moved through London's drawing rooms like wildfire. Has the Duke lost his mind? She's nothing. No beauty, no fortune, no connections. Mrs. Nash felt the weight of it at Lady Pemberton's afternoon tea, where Mrs. Hartwell suggested sweetly that Paige must be very accomplished in ways we haven't noticed. The implication was clear and poisonous. Mrs. Nash returned home in tears. Paige found her in the drawing room, handkerchief pressed to her eyes, and realized with sinking clarity that her honesty wasn't just costing her, it was costing the people she loved. At White's, Louis faced his own inquisition. A duke doesn't marry for conversation, Westwick. He marries for bloodlines and alliances. Lord Ashworth pulled him aside. Are you certain this isn't rebellion? Choosing her because she's the opposite of what's expected? Louis considered this, honestly. 6 months ago, you might have been right, but it's been weeks now. I know the difference between novelty and necessity. Paige overheard 2 young ladies at a garden party. He's simply bored, and she's a curiosity. It will end. She left early, shaken. When Louis called the next day, she told him, "Perhaps you should reconsider. The cost is too high." He waited until she met his eyes. "I don't want credit. I want truth. If I wanted a woman who enhanced my reputation, I'd have married Dorothea Hartwell 3 years ago and been miserable for the rest of my life." The spectacle Dorothea promised came at the Cavendish ball. It didn't start with a scream, but with a letter found near the punch bowl, passed from hand to hand until whispers erupted like flames. The letter, allegedly written by Paige to a cousin, detailed a calculated plan to capture the Duke's interest by playing difficult. Dorothea cornered Paige near the center of the ballroom, where eyes were already turning. "You must know this is temporary," she said, her voice carrying. "He's fascinated by the novelty, the quiet wallflower who finally speaks. But when he realizes honest is just another performance, everyone will know you were playing a part to snag a crown." She produced the letter with theatrical precision. The orchestra seemed to falter, the music replaced by the sharp, rhythmic rustle of silk as 100 guests leaned in to hear the kill. "Tell me, Paige, is it honesty to have written about how easily a duke might be manipulated?" Paige had never written such a thing. It was a perfect, surgical lie. But she didn't crumble. "Lady Dorothea, I've been ordinary my entire life. I've been overlooked, dismissed, and ignored. If you leave now, you'll never see her stand tall against society. Can you really let that happen? If you think a forged letter can destroy someone who has already survived being nothing, you are mistaken." She walked away, but as she passed through the crowd, she saw Louis standing by the doors. He stood with the letter in his hand, his knuckles white against the paper. Louis arrived at the Nash townhouse the morning after the Cavendish ball. Paige met him in the drawing room, her face pale with sleepless anxiety. He held up the letter, the forged one, and her breath caught. "I burned the original," he said, his voice low and certain. "I didn't even need to ask if it was true. I know your handwriting, and more importantly, I know your heart. Dorothea underestimated one thing. I've spent 7 years being lied to. I know the truth when I finally hold it." Paige's eyes filled with tears. "Everyone believes it. Then we'll prove them wrong, tonight, at the Cheltenham Ball." The Cheltenham Ball was the season's most prominent event. Louis escorted Paige personally, a deliberate statement. She wore a new dress, deeper blue, more fashionable. "You look lovely," he said. She replied, "I look like I'm trying too hard." In the carriage, he took her hand. "Tonight will be difficult. Everyone will be watching, but I need you to trust me. The entire ton is watching, and you might walk away. Don't miss Paige's moment of triumph. Subscribe now." They entered together. The ballroom went quiet before conversation resumed with electric energy. As they crossed the floor, they passed Dorothea. She stood with her mother, her expression carefully composed, waiting to witness Paige's social destruction. Instead, she saw Louis's hand firmly clasping Paige's, saw him look at her with unmistakable devotion. Dorothea's smile faltered. Her best weapon hadn't just failed, it had pushed him closer. Louis led Paige to the center of the room, introducing her to peers, making his intentions unmistakable. When dancing began, he claimed her first waltz. As they moved across the floor, Paige whispered,
Everyone is staring, he replied. Let them, she protested. I'm going to embarrass you. He met her eyes. You could trip over my feet 10 times, and I'd still be the luckiest man in this room. Something shifted. She stopped monitoring the watching eyes and just danced with him. For the first time in 3 years, she felt present. After the waltz, Lord Pemberton approached, within earshot of several guests. Westwick, Miss Nash lacks the grace and bearing expected of a duchess. Louis's voice carried, cold and clear. I remember you speaking with Miss Nash at her first ball. When she answered your question thoughtfully, you walked away as if she'd committed a social crime. She was intelligent, and you punished her for it. Miss Nash has more integrity in her smallest gesture than this entire ballroom possesses collectively. If society finds her inappropriate, then society's standards are worthless. The surrounding guests fell silent. The music seemed distant. Louis offered Paige his arm and led her away, leaving Pemberton standing alone in a circle of witnesses. The rules of the ballroom had just been rewritten. Lady Ashworth approached Paige afterward. I've been watching you both. When he's with you, his shoulders come down. You're not exciting or thrilling. You're peaceful. For a man at war with expectation for 7 years, peace is revolutionary. In the carriage home, the silence was profound after the ballroom's chaos. Paige breathed in the quiet. I need you to be certain. Louis took her hands. You're not easy. You're necessary. I'm asking your father tomorrow for permission to propose, but I need to know, if I ask, will you say yes? She saw no doubt in his eyes, just certainty. Yes, she whispered. If you're foolish enough to ask, I'm foolish enough to accept. He kissed her in that peaceful silence, with London passing outside, and the future, suddenly, impossibly real.
Louis arrived at the Nash residence the following afternoon with a ring that belonged to his grandmother. Simple, elegant, sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. Not the massive statement piece expected of a ducal betrothal, but something that felt like Paige, understated, beautiful, substantial. He was nervous, actually nervous. Mr. Nash received him in the library, kind but serious. Your Grace, I'll be direct. My daughter is not what society expects. She reads too much, speaks too freely, and has never learned the art of pleasing people who don't deserve her intelligence. Are you certain? Louis met his eyes. Mr. Nash, I'm spent 7 years being pleased with women who studied me like a test. Your daughter is the only woman who's ever treated me like a man who could be wrong. She's the only future I can imagine that doesn't feel like suffocation. Mr. Nash studied him. If you hurt her, title or no title, you'll answer to me. Louis replied quietly, Sir, if I hurt her, I'll deserve whatever you care to do to me. Permission was granted. Paige was in the garden, reading, when Louis found her. She looked up, saw his expression, and understood immediately. Oh no, you're actually going to do it. He smiled. I am. She protested. Louis, please think about this. He interrupted gently. I've thought about nothing else for weeks. Paige, stand up. She did, reluctantly. He took her hands. I'm not going to give you a speech about your beauty because there are women more conventionally beautiful. I'm not going to praise your accomplishments by society's standards. I'm not going to tell you that you'll make a perfect duchess because perfection is performance, and I'm done with performance. What I will tell you is this. You are the first person in 7 years who's made me feel like myself. You argue with me. You challenge me. You trust me enough to be honest even when it's uncomfortable. I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking you to marry me exactly as you are, difficult and honest and brilliant and real. Paige Nash, will you marry me? She was crying. I'm going to be terrible at being a duchess. If you leave now, you'll never see her answer, never see her joy. Don't abandon this moment. Subscribe and witness it. He replied, I don't care. She continued, Society is going to despise this match, he said firmly.
I don't care about that either. Her voice broke. What if I disappoint you? What if the truth of me isn't enough? He pulled out the ring. The truth of you is everything. This was my grandmother's. She was stubborn, opinionated, and completely uninterested in society's approval. My grandfather loved her desperately until the day she died. I'd like to follow his example. Paige looked at the ring, then at him. Finally, she whispered, "Yes. God help us both, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They sat together in the garden, hands linked, both somewhat shocked. "This is going to be so hard," Paige said. Louis turned to face her fully. "You've survived 3 years of being invisible. You've endured dismissal and cruelty while maintaining your integrity. If you can survive that, you can survive anything." She replied softly, "I survived by being invisible. I can't be invisible as your wife." Even as she said it, she noticed movement at the garden wall. Neighbors peering through the hedges, a servant watching from an upstairs window. The world was already pressing in. Their peace was a bubble, and everyone was trying to pop it. He squeezed her hand. "No, but you don't have to be anything other than yourself. I'll handle everyone else." But as they sat in the quiet garden, the sounds of London, the rattling carriages, the shouting hawkers, the relentless machinery of the Taun seemed louder than ever. Across town, Dorothea Hartwell stood in her dressing room, staring at her own reflection. She picked up a pair of shears and slowly, methodically, began to shred the blue silk dress she had worn to the ball. "He thinks he's found peace," she whispered to the empty room. "He has no idea what he's actually invited into his life."
The announcement appeared in the morning papers. Society's response was immediate and divided. Older peers who valued character over beauty approved quietly. Families who had positioned their daughters for Louis disapproved loudly. And everyone gossiped with specific cruelty. She must be with child. Why else would he settle? Plain little mouse, trapping a duke with God knows what schemes. Mark my words, he'll come to his senses and set her aside before the vows are spoken. Paige endured the engagement period like a trial by fire. At the modiste's shop, society ladies fell silent when she entered. She overheard whispered comments designed to wound. "Can you imagine that figure in a duchess's gown? The poor silk will do all the work. Perhaps good dressmaking can work miracles. She'll certainly need them." The modiste was professional, but cool, clearly wondering if this commission would bring credit or shame. Paige stood in her chemise for hours while seamstresses circled, discussing alterations as if she weren't present. She felt like a body being prepared for presentation, all agency removed. As she waited, Paige looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were clean. Completely clean. For the first time in years, there wasn't a single ink stain on her fingers. She'd been too occupied with fittings and social calls to read or write. The absence felt like an erasure, a small death of the person she'd been. When she finally escaped, Louis was waiting in his carriage. He took one look at her face and ordered the driver to Hyde Park. "Tell me," he said. She described not the cruelty, but the objectification, the sense of being transformed into something she wasn't. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can elope, go to Scotland, marry quietly." She was tempted, desperately tempted, but shook her head. "No, if we run, they'll say I was ashamed, that you were ashamed. We do this properly, or everyone will believe they were right about me." He pulled her close, right there in Hyde Park, scandalously. "You're already everything I need. You've always been that." Lady Westwick hosted a breakfast to introduce Paige to the family. The drawing room was crowded with relatives in their carefully watching eyes. Louis's aunt said sweetly, projecting her voice so the assembled company could hear, "Miss Nash, you must be very accomplished. What do you do particularly well?" It was a trap, and a public one. Society expected music, art, needlework, areas where Paige had no skill. The room waited for her humiliation. Paige met her gaze calmly. "I read widely, Lady Somerton,
and I think carefully about what I read. Beyond that, I'm afraid, I'm quite ordinary." She didn't apologize, didn't qualify. The word ordinary hung in the air like a quiet declaration of pride. The aunt's eyes narrowed, unable to decide if Paige was being rude or genuine. Several guests exchanged glances, surprised by the simple dignity of the response. Later, Louie's mother spoke with Paige privately. "My son has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you. I don't understand this match, but I understand my son. He's been lonely his entire life. Whatever you are to him, it's something he needs. For that alone, I'm grateful." It wasn't quite approval, but it was acceptance. At a crowded reception, Lady Dorothea cornered Paige near the refreshment table, all civility abandoned. Several guests were within earshot, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "You've won, but understand this. You'll spend your entire marriage knowing you're not what he should have had. Every time society looks through you, every time you fail to live up to what a duchess should be, you'll remember that you took something that wasn't meant for you." Paige has survived society's cruelty. Can you survive leaving her story unfinished? Subscribe, or you'll miss the full victory. Paige met her gaze steadily, her voice clear enough to carry. "Lady Dorothea, I spent 3 years believing I wasn't meant for anything. I survived that. I'll survive your disapproval too." Dorothea swept away, furious at being dismissed so publicly. The nearby guests pretended to be busying themselves with their tea, but Paige caught more than one small, satisfied smile. Dorothea's power was evaporating, and people had seen it happen. 3 days before the wedding, Paige had a moment of complete panic, surrounded by wedding preparations, unable to breathe. Marianne found her. "I can't do this. I can't be what he needs." Marianne took her shoulders. "For 3 years, I watched you disappear, and then he came along, and for the first time, I saw you come alive. He's chosen you knowing everything. You're not going to fail him by being yourself." She paused, then added, "You know what's strange? Ever since the announcement, people have been treating me differently, better. Invitations I never received before, compliments on my gown, all because I'm going to be sister-in-law to a duke." She squeezed Paige's hands. "Your choice has changed things for both of us. Don't let fear steal that away." The night before the wedding, Louie sent a letter. "Tomorrow, I marry the only person who's ever made me feel like myself. I know you're afraid, but I need you to know I see you. Not what society says you should be, not what you fear you aren't. You are enough. You have always been enough." She held the letter to her chest, then reached for her pen to reply. As she wrote, she watched the familiar ink stain bloom across her index finger, a mark of herself returning. For the first time, she let herself believe it might actually work.
The wedding took place at St. George's, Hanover Square. The church was full of society's elite, half present to witness, half to judge. Paige walked down the aisle in ivory silk, simple and elegant, terrified with every step. Every eye assessed her, every whisper questioned her. Then she saw Louie at the altar, and everything else faded. His expression wasn't polite admiration, it was relief, as if he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale, as if she wasn't the woman he was settling for, but the only woman he'd been waiting for. She reached him, he took her hand, whispered, "You're perfect." "I'm terrified." "So am I. Let's be terrified together." The ceremony proceeded. When they said their vows, they didn't recite them mechanically. They spoke them directly to each other, as promises they meant. When the vicar pronounced them married, Louie kissed her properly, in full view of everyone, with no apology. It was a statement. "This is my choice, my wife, my truth." The wedding breakfast at the Westwick London residence was magnificent, formal, and exhausting. Paige stood beside Louie, receiving congratulations that ranged from genuine to grudging. Lord Ashworth toasted them graciously. Some guests applauded. Others exchanged looks. Lady Ashworth approached Paige privately. "You survived. Well done. The hard part is just beginning." "No, the hard part was believing you deserved this. Now you just have to live it." After the breakfast, they retreated to Westwick Hall. As the city faded behind them during the 3-hour journey, something in both of them unclenched. "How do you feel?" Louis asked. "Like I just climbed a mountain and I'm not sure I can feel my legs." He laughed. "Accurate?" Westwick Hall was magnificent, ancient, sprawling, beautiful, but Louis didn't give her a formal tour. Instead, he took her directly to the library. It was 3 stories tall, lined with books, with comfortable chairs and good light and a fireplace, clearly a room that was used, loved. "I thought you should know where I spend most of my time," he said, "and where I hope you'll spend time too." Paige walked along the shelves, trailing her fingers over spines. "We're really going to be all right, aren't we?" "We are, because we chose each other knowing the truth. No performance, no masks, just us." The first weeks revealed the texture of their life together. They breakfasted together, reading newspapers, occasionally reading passages aloud to debate. Comfortable, companionable. This was what they both wanted. Partnership. Paige found a neglected garden and began planning its restoration. The head gardener was skeptical until she demonstrated she actually knew about plants, soil, and growing seasons. She earned his respect through competence, not rank. One evening at dinner, Louis looked up from his book and said simply, "I'm happy." Paige realized she was too. Actually genuinely happy, not in the dramatic way novels described, but in the quiet, sustainable way that meant home. When they returned to London for the season's end, society's reception remained mixed. Some had decided that if the Duke was pleased, the match must be acceptable. Others watched constantly for signs of failure. At one ball, Paige overheard, "She's certainly not what we expected." No, but perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. At least we know she married him for love, not title. Faint praise, but Paige recognized it as progress. What changed wasn't Paige. She remained thoughtful, honest, occasionally awkward. What changed was her confidence. She stopped apologizing for existing. When someone made a cutting remark, she met it with calm dignity. She wasn't trying to win society's approval anymore. She was just being herself, and trusting that was enough. After one particularly difficult engagement where Paige handled condescension with grace, Louis told her, "I'm in awe of you. You walk into rooms full of people who dismiss you and you don't flinch. You don't perform. You just exist. Truthfully, that takes more courage than anything I've ever done. I learned it from you. You chose me publicly, knowing what it would cost. No, that was necessary. You're what's brave." 6 months into their marriage, Paige received a letter from a young woman she didn't know. "I'm told I'm too opinionated, too bookish, too honest to attract a suitable husband. I was resigned to failure until I heard about you. You give me hope that perhaps honesty isn't a fatal flaw. Thank you for existing." Paige showed the letter to Louis, tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd matter to anyone except you. You matter to everyone who's ever been told they're too much or too little. You're proof that being yourself isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning." The story ends in the Westwick Library on a rainy evening, fire crackling, comfortable silence. Louis watches Paige absorbed in her reading, making notes in the margin, completely unself-conscious, completely herself. "What?" she asks, noticing his attention. "I was just thinking about the first time we spoke, on the terrace, when you told me I looked like I was cataloging species." She smiles. "You did, exhausted and analytical. I was drowning, and you threw me a rope without even knowing it. Truth. You gave me 5 minutes of honest conversation in a world of performance." She sets down her book and moves beside him. "And now I have it every day. Every morning when you argue with the newspaper, every afternoon when you tell me my estate management ideas are outdated, every evening when you look at me like I'm just a man, not a duke. You are just a man, a good man. Exactly.
and you're the only person who's ever treated me that way." They sit in comfortable silence, hands linked. "Louie, yes, I'm glad I failed at being invisible. I'm glad I was too honest and too plain and too difficult, because all of that led here. Not despite who you are, because of who you are. I know that now." And she does. For the first time in her life, Paige Nash, now Paige Parley, Duchess of Westwick, knows she's enough exactly as she is. You've seen her journey, her triumph, but what about the next story? Don't be the viewer who leaves now. Subscribe and witness every moment of truth next time, not because she changed to fit the world, but because she found the one person who didn't need her to. 1 year later, they're back in the library. Paige reads to their infant daughter, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's thoughtfulness. "What are you reading to her?" Louie asks. "Wollstonecraft. Might as well start her education early." He laughs. "Society is going to be horrified. Society is always horrified. We'll manage." He crosses to them, looking down at his wife and daughter. "We'll do more than manage. We'll teach her that truth matters more than approval, that being herself is the greatest gift she can give the world." Just like her parents. Exactly like her parents. Outside, London continues its complicated social dance. Inside Westwick Hall, a family built on truth, respect, and honest love creates their own world, one where being yourself is not just accepted, but celebrated. For Paige, the woman who was ignored in every ballroom, who was told she was too much and not enough, who made peace with invisibility and then chose visibility, this is everything. Not because she conquered society, but because she found someone who loved the truth of her more than the performance of anyone else. The truth they offered each other, frightening, unglamorous, imperfect truth, became the foundation of a love that didn't just survive, but flourished.